The world at 35,000 feet was a world of polished surfaces and hidden currents. For Amara Johnson, it was a world she had learned to navigate with a smile that was both her shield and her weapon. The hum of the Airbus A330 was a familiar lullaby, a constant, vibrating note that underscored her every movement. Today, the sky was a relentless, brilliant blue over the Atlantic, a stark contrast to the muted, beige-toned luxury of the business-class cabin. She moved with an economy of motion born from hundreds of flights, her hands a blur of efficient grace as she arranged linen napkins, chilled flutes of champagne, and offered warm towels with a quiet, "Welcome aboard." Her uniform, a crisp navy blue dress with a scarlet scarf tied precisely at her neck, felt like a second skin, a costume for the role of the ever-competent, ever-serene flight attendant. But beneath the costume was a woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of this metal tube. "Anything else I can get for you, Mr. Henderson?" she asked a pharmaceutical executive who always requested an extra pillow and a glass of Macallan before napping. "You're an angel, Amara," he said, already pulling down his eye mask. "As always." She smiled, a genuine one this time. "The passengers who saw you as a person, not just part of the aircraft's furniture, made the job worthwhile." She continued down the aisle, her gaze sweeping over the occupants. A mother struggling with a toddler whom she made a mental note to check on later. A couple holding hands, lost in their own world. A man scowling at his laptop, the glow of the screen etching lines of stress on his face. She was a curator of comfort, a silent guardian of peace in this pressurized chamber. In the galley, the quiet hum was broken by the sharper, more animated chatter of her colleagues. Chloe, a blonde woman with a laugh that was a little too loud, was recounting a date from the layover in Barcelona. "He was gorgeous, I'm telling you, and his family owned like a vineyard in Tuscany. Can you imagine?" Amara busied herself restocking the mineral water, offering a noncommittal smile. Chloe's world was one of fleeting romances and aspirational encounters, a world Amara had consciously stepped away from. At 28, she was done with pilots who saw flight attendants as a perk of the job, done with the transient connections that left you feeling emptier than before. She wanted something real, something that could be built on the ground, not just in the ephemeral space between destinations. Her mother's voice, warm and laced with the hard-won wisdom of a black woman who had raised a daughter alone, echoed in her mind. "Don't you go falling for those smooth talkers in uniforms, baby girl. Their heads are in the clouds and their hearts are usually parked in their wallets. You find a man whose feet are on the ground, you hear. A good man." Amara loved her mother fiercely, but she also believed with a stubborn optimism that a good man could wear a pilot's wings. He would just have to be different. The chime from the cockpit was a soft, authoritative ding that cut through the galley gossip. It was the captain's call. Chloe nudged her. "That's your cue, new girl. Captain Hayes likes his coffee black and he likes it delivered with a smile. Don't keep the golden boy waiting." Amara felt a flutter of something, not nerves exactly, but anticipation. Captain Richard Hayes. His name was already legend among the crew. Young for a wide-body captain, handsome in a classic, clean-cut way with a reputation for being brilliant, charming, and notoriously private. He was the airline's wunderkind, the son of old money, groomed for the left seat from birth. She had seen him in briefings, a commanding presence who listened intently and spoke with a calm authority that instantly quieted a room. She prepared the coffee, her hands steady, and made her way to the flight deck. She tapped lightly on the door before entering. The cockpit was a symphony of quiet technology, a panorama of dials, screens, and the infinite blue. The first officer, a man named Ben, glanced back and gave her a friendly wink, but it was the man in the left seat who commanded attention. Captain Richard Hayes turned, and his smile was like the sunrise breaking over the horizon. It was warm, open, and completely disarming. His eyes, a startling shade of blue-green, crinkled at the corners. "Ah, the savior with the caffeine," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone that resonated in the small space. "Thank you." "Amara," she supplied, handing him the mug. Their fingers brushed briefly, and a jolt, small but undeniable, passed between them. "Amara," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "That's beautiful. Thank you, Amara." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and in that moment she saw something beyond the professional charm. She saw a flicker of curiosity, of genuine interest. "Of course, Captain, anything else?" "We're good up here, smooth sailing all the way to JFK. He took a sip of the coffee. "Perfect." She nodded, a faint blush warming her cheeks, and retreated from the cockpit. The image of his smile burned onto her retina. The next few hours passed in the usual rhythm of meal service, drink rounds, and answering call bells. But Amara found her thoughts drifting back to the flight deck, to that brief electric moment. It was foolish, she told herself. He was a captain. She was a flight attendant. He was from a world of country clubs and trust funds. She was from a 3-story walk-up in Queens, raised by a nurse who worked double shifts to put her through community college. The chasm between their lives was as vast as the ocean beneath them. During the descent into New York, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. It was nothing severe, just the usual bumps and jolts, but it was enough to send a ripple of anxiety through the cabin. A few passengers gasped. Amara, strapped into her jumpseat, went through the mandatory safety check, her voice calm and reassuring over the PA system. She caught a glimpse of Chloe, whose knuckles were white as she gripped her armrests. But Amara felt no fear. She had a deep, intrinsic trust in the machinery, the procedures, and the people in the cockpit. Specifically, she trusted the man whose steady hands were on the controls. She imagined Captain Hayes up there, his voice calm as he spoke to air traffic control, his movements sure and deliberate as he guided the massive aircraft through the choppy air. There was a safety in his competence that she found profoundly attractive. After landing, as the passengers disembarked in a weary stream, the crew began their post-flight duties. Amara was in the aft galley, counting liquor miniatures when he appeared. "Great job today, everyone," Captain Hayes said, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. He looked directly at Amara. "Especially you. I heard you handled that nervous flyer in 12B with kid gloves. He sought me out to compliment you." Amara looked up, surprised. "Oh, thank you, Captain, it was nothing." "It's never nothing," he said, his tone serious for a moment. "It's everything. That's what makes a great crew." He glanced at the paperwork in her hand. "Almost done here." "Just about." "Good. I'm heading to the crew lounge to finish the paperwork. Maybe I'll see you there." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, layered with quiet intention. He gave her another one of those smiles before turning and heading up the jet bridge. Chloe materialized beside her, her eyes wide. "Wow, the great Captain Hayes bestowing his royal presence upon the peasant class. And he was looking at you, Amara. I mean, really looking." "Don't be ridiculous," Amara said, her heart thumping a traitorous rhythm against her ribs. "I'm not. He's never said more than 2 words to me. Be careful, though. That one, he's a different breed. All the charm in the world, but I've heard he's allergic to commitment. His family practically owns a wing of the country club. You know how that goes." Amara did know. Or at least she could imagine. The unspoken rules, the silent judgments, the pressure to conform. The world was quick to label a black woman, quicker still to condemn her. A relationship with a man like Richard Hayes wouldn't be just a relationship. It would be a statement, a crossing of lines that many still believed were firmly drawn. An hour later, showered and changed into jeans and a simple sweater, Amara walked into the bustling airline crew lounge. It was a cavernous space filled with the low murmur of tired voices, the smell of stale coffee, and the glow of flight status monitors. Pilots and flight attendants in various states of off-duty were clustered around tables, debriefing, complaining, flirting. She saw him immediately. He was sitting alone at a small table in the corner, a laptop open in front of him, a half-empty coffee cup at his elbow. He looked different out of uniform, softer, more approachable in a dark green sweater. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. His eyes found hers across the room, and he gestured to the empty chair opposite him. Every sensible voice in her head, her mother's, Chloe's, her own, told her to get her bag, go home, and forget this ever happened. But her feet, it seemed, were not listening. They carried her across the lounge, through the maze of tables and watching eyes, until she was standing before him. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, closing his laptop. "I had to finish my reports," she said, the excuse sounding weak even to her. "Of course," he smiled. "Can I get you a coffee, or something stronger? God knows I need something stronger after that headwind." "Coffee is fine," she said, sitting down. He went to the counter and returned with 2 fresh cups. He sat, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. "So, Amara Johnson, tell me something about you that isn't in your employee file." So she did, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth. She told him about her mother, about studying literature and falling into the airline life almost by accident, about her love for old jazz records and her dream of one day writing a novel. He listened, truly listened, his gaze never wavering from her face. He, in turn, spoke of his love for flying, the freedom of the sky, but also his frustration with the corporate politics of the airline, the weight of his family's expectations. "They have my entire life mapped out," he confessed, a shadow crossing his handsome features. "The right career, the right friends, the right wife. Sometimes it feels like I'm just a passenger in my own life." In that moment, he wasn't the untouchable Captain Hayes. He was just Richard, a man who felt as trapped by his circumstances as she sometimes felt liberated by hers. The connection was immediate and profound, a spark igniting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. He walked her to the employee parking lot as a cold New York wind whipped around them. The city lights glittered in the distance, a tapestry of a million possibilities. "I'd like to see you again, Amara," he said, his breath misting in the air. "Not as crew, just as us." She looked up at him, at the hope and the vulnerability in his eyes, and felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "I'd like that too, Richard." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good, I'll call you." As she drove away from the airport, the towering terminals shrinking in her rearview mirror, Amara felt a buoyant, terrifying hope take flight in her chest. She knew the risks. She knew the world they lived in. But as she merged onto the highway, heading towards the familiar lights of Queens, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. Something that could, against all odds, find a way to land. Chapter 2. The call came 2 days later as promised. Amara's phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, lighting up with an unknown number. Her heart did a little flip, a traitorous leap of hope she tried to quash as she answered with a professional, "Amara Johnson speaking." "Amara, it's Richard Hayes." His voice was slightly hesitant, a stark contrast to his cockpit confidence. "I hope it's okay that I got your number from crew scheduling. I said I'd call." The formality was endearing. "It's okay," she said, leaning against the counter, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm glad you did. I have a 4-day layover in Paris next week. The Ritz. I know it's short notice, but I've managed to get a ticket on my same flight for a friend, if you're interested." Paris, the Ritz. It was a world away from coffee in the crew lounge. It was a statement. She thought of Chloe's warning, her mother's voice. Then she thought of the way he'd looked at her, the vulnerability in his confession. This wasn't a pilot trying to add a notch to his belt. This was a man taking a risk. I'd have to check my schedule," she said, the practical part of her surfacing. "And it would have to be separate. The booking, the check-in, everything." "Of course," he said quickly, understanding immediately. "Discretion is paramount. I'll have my assistant book everything, separate everything. You'll just need to get to JFK." The ease with which he said, "my assistant," was a reminder of the chasm between them. She worked for a living, he had people who worked for him, but the excitement in his voice was contagious. "Then yes," she said, the word feeling both dangerous and exhilarating. "Yes, I'll come." The week that followed was a blur of anticipation and secret preparations. She told her mother she was using her standby benefits for a quick solo trip to Europe, a lie that tasted sour on her tongue. She told Chloe and the other crew she was visiting a cousin in Chicago. The deception felt necessary, a protective shell around the fragile, budding thing between her and Richard. The flight to Paris was an exercise in surrealism. There he was, up front in the cockpit, his voice calm and authoritative over the PA system. "This is Captain Hayes speaking. We're looking at a smooth flight across the pond tonight with an on-time arrival into a beautiful Paris morning." And there she was, in the back, serving drinks and meals, catching the occasional fleeting glance from the first officer as he came back to use the lavatory, a glance that seemed to see nothing and everything all at once. They did not speak, did not even look at each other as they disembarked at Charles de Gaulle. She followed the crew bus instructions to the hotel, her heart hammering as the grand facade of the Ritz Paris came into view. He was already there, waiting in the opulent lobby, looking out of place in his casual clothes amidst the gilt and marble. When he saw her, his face broke into a relief so profound it stole her breath. "You came," he said, taking her small roller bag from her. "I said I would." He had booked adjoining rooms, a compromise between propriety and intimacy. The moment the door to his suite closed behind them, the professional distance evaporated. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I've been thinking about this since New York," he whispered, before his lips found hers. The kiss was not like the brief, electric brush of fingers in the cockpit. It was deep, searching, and full of a pent-up longing that mirrored her own. For 3 days, Paris belonged to them. They were ghosts in the city of light, two anonymous lovers lost in its beauty. They walked along the Seine as the sun set, its water turning to liquid gold. They shared quiet coffees in tucked-away cafes in Saint-Germain, their conversation flowing as easily as the wine they drank with dinner. He told her about the suffocating expectations of his old-money New England family, his father's disappointment that he'd chosen a glorified bus driver career instead of finance, his mother's endless parade of suitable debutantes. "They want a replica of themselves," he said, swirling the burgundy in his glass. "A life lived in beige. You're all color, Amara. You're vibrant, you're real." She told him about growing up as an only child, about the sound of her mother's tired footsteps on the stairs, about the weight of being her mother's entire world and her greatest hope. She spoke of the quiet racism she faced on the job, the passengers who subtly handed their trash to the white flight attendant next to her, the older ladies who clutched their purses tighter when she passed, the constant, low-grade need to be twice as good for half the recognition. He listened, his brow furrowed in anger and empathy. "It's barbaric. I'm so sorry you have to deal with that." In the sanctuary of his suite, with the sounds of Paris drifting up from the street below, the world and its prejudices felt far away. They made love for the first time in the soft, filtered light of a Parisian afternoon, and it was tender and fierce all at once. Afterward, he held her, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare arm. "This is real, isn't it?" he murmured into her hair. "It feels real," she whispered back, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. But reality had a way of intruding. On their last evening as they dressed for dinner, his phone buzzed incessantly. He finally sighed and picked it up. "It's my father," he answered, his voice shifting into a different register, polite, reserved, slightly defensive. "Yes, sir. The flight was fine. No, I'm not alone. I'm with some of the crew." Amara turned away, pretending to fix her earring in the ornate mirror. The lie, though necessary, felt like a shard of ice in the warm Parisian air. He was hiding her. He was ashamed. He hung up and came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and meeting her gaze in the reflection. "I'm sorry about that." "It's fine," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It's not fine," he said, his voice low. "But you have to understand, Amara. My father, his world is very small, very white. He wouldn't understand, he would see complications, problems." "And what do you see?" she asked, turning in his arms to face him. "I see you," he said, his eyes earnest. "I see the woman I'm falling in love with. That's all that matters to me. We just have to be smart about this, for now." For now, the words were a promise and a prison. She nodded, burying her unease. He was choosing her, wasn't he? He was here with her in Paris. That had to count for something. Back in New York, their secret life began. It was a delicate, complicated dance. They were meticulous, paranoid even. They never flew on the same trips if they could help it. They never arrived or left the crew lounge together. Their dates were in neighborhoods where they were unlikely to run into airline personnel, a tiny Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem, a indie cinema in the West Village, long walks along the Hudson River Park. In the dark, in her modest apartment in Queens, with the sounds of the city a distant hum, it was easy to believe their bubble was impenetrable. He was different there, more relaxed, more himself. He loved her mother's cooking, devouring the jerk chicken and rice and peas Amara had learned to make, declaring it better than any five-star meal. He helped her grade the practice tests for the English class she taught at the community center on her days off. He fit into her world in a way that felt natural, right? But the outside world was always pressing in. One evening, after a particularly lovely day, they were walking hand in hand back to her apartment when a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the curb. The window slid down and a man in a chauffeur's cap nodded. "Mr. Hayes, your father asked me to ensure you got home all right. He said you weren't answering your phone." Richard's hand tightened around hers, then dropped as if her skin had burned him. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a guarded neutrality. "Thank you, Charles. You can tell my father I'm perfectly capable of getting myself home." His voice was clipped, cold. The driver's eyes flickered to Amara, then back to Richard. A silent judgment passed in that millisecond. "Very good, sir." The car pulled away, a silent, menacing shadow. The spell was broken. "He has people watching me," Richard said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "I'm 34 years old, and he has his driver checking up on me like I'm a teenager." Amara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "He knows, doesn't he?" "He suspects," Richard corrected, taking her hand again, but the gesture felt hollow now. "He knows I'm seeing someone he wouldn't approve of. He doesn't know it's you. He doesn't get to know. This is my life." But as they walked the rest of the way in silence, Amara felt the first, cold trickle of doubt. Was it his life? Or was it a life on loan from his family, a life that could be revoked at any moment? She looked at his profile, tense and worried, and the man she loved seemed to shrink, becoming a boy afraid of his father's disapproval. That night as he slept, she watched him. In the dim light from the street, his face was peaceful, innocent. She traced the line of his jaw, her heart aching with a love that was becoming tainted with fear. He was torn, she could see that now. Torn between the life he'd been born into and the life he wanted to build with her. She just didn't know which side would win. And for the first time, the secret that had once felt like a protective shield began to feel like a premonition of a coming storm. Chapter 3. The bubble, once as vast and private as the sky they worked in, began to feel suffocatingly small. The incident with his father's driver had left a hairline fracture in their relationship, a flaw in the crystal that caught the light at inopportune times. Richard was more attentive than ever in private, his lovemaking more intense, his conversations more probing, as if he could cement their connection through sheer force of will. But in public, the distance he maintained was now a chasm, and Amara felt herself constantly teetering on its edge. Their secret meetings continued, but the thrill was now tinged with anxiety. A date at a secluded beach on a layover in Malibu was interrupted by the arrival of another pilot family Richard knew. Amara watched from a distance as he seamlessly slipped into his Captain Hayes persona, all easy charm and polished small talk, never once glancing in her direction. She sat alone on her towel, the sun feeling cold on her skin until he texted her an hour later. "So sorry. Coast is clear. Meet you at the car." She began to notice the subtle hierarchies of the airline, the unspoken codes she had always been aware of but now felt with the sharpness of a personal insult. In the crew lounge, senior captains like Richard held court in leather armchairs, while flight attendants, especially junior ones like her, perched on the edges of couches. She saw how the male pilots were called captain as a term of respect, while the female flight attendants, regardless of age or experience, were often called by their first names or, worse, sweetheart by the older male crew. One afternoon, waiting for a deadhead flight to London, she sat near a group of senior flight attendants and pilots, Richard among them. He was laughing at a joke told by a grizzled captain named Doug, a man with a reputation for being a good-all boy. "So then the new girl," Doug was saying, his voice carrying, "she comes up to the flight deck, beautiful thing, but she's from, I don't know, Trinidad or something. She says, 'Captain, can I get you anything?' And I said, 'Honey, you can get me a smile.' And she just stared at me. No sense of humor, these ones." A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Richard's laugh was a short, polite exhale. He caught Amara's eye across the room, and for a split second his expression was one of pained apology before he quickly looked away, turning back to Doug with a neutral mask. Amara felt a hot flush of shame and anger crawl up her neck. She was one of these ones. She was the new girl from Trinidad or something. And Richard, the man who whispered love into her hair in the dark, would not even meet her gaze in the light of day to acknowledge the insult. Later, in the privacy of a hotel room in London, she confronted him. "You just sat there while he said that." Richard sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Amara, what did you want me to do? Cause a scene? Doug's a dinosaur. He's from a different time. It's easier to just let it go." "Easier for who?" she shot back, her voice trembling. "For you. It's not easier for me. It's not easier for the woman he was talking about. When you don't say anything, you're saying you agree with him." "That's not true," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "You know it's not true, but I have to work with these people. My career, my reputation, it's built on these relationships. I can't go around being the woke police for every outdated comment." The woke police. The term felt like a dismissal, reducing her very real pain to a political inconvenience. She turned away from him, looking out the window at the London rain. "So our entire relationship has to be a secret because your reputation can't handle the truth, and you can't stand up for basic decency because your career can't handle the truth. What part of your life can handle the truth, Richard?" He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. "The part that's with you," he murmured. "The only part that really matters. This is the real world, Amara. My world. It's messy and it's unfair, but we have to be smart. We have to pick our battles." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man in this room, holding her, was the real one, and the one in the crew lounge was the performance. But the performance was starting to feel alarmingly permanent. The pressure from his family intensified. His mother began calling more frequently, her name popping up on his phone screen with a relentlessness that felt like an assault. He started taking the calls in another room, his voice a low, placating murmur. After one such call, he returned to the couch where they were watching a movie, his face drawn. "They're throwing a fundraiser for my father's alma mater," he said quietly. "A big one, at the club. They expect me to bring a date. They've arranged for me to escort the daughter of one of his business partners." Amara's blood ran cold. She looked at him, waiting for him to say the words, to declare that he would take her instead, to finally bring her out of the shadows. He didn't. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a miserable plea for understanding. "It's just one night, Amara. It doesn't mean anything. You have to know that. It's politics. Family politics." The silence that stretched between them was heavier than any they had ever shared. It was filled with the crushing weight of the unspoken truth. She was his secret, his rebellion, his private joy, but she would never be his public partner. Not in the world that mattered to his career and his family. "I see," she said finally, her voice flat. She stood up and turned off the television. "I think I'm tired. I'm going to bed." He didn't follow her immediately. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of him moving around the suite, the clink of a glass, the sigh of the sofa springs. When he finally slipped into bed beside her, he didn't try to touch her. The space between them in the king-sized bed felt wider than the Atlantic. A few days later, back in New York, she visited her mother. The small Queen's apartment was a sanctuary of authenticity, filled with the smells of incense and curry chicken. Her mother took one look at her and knew. "It's that pilot, isn't it?" she said, not looking up from the plantain she was slicing. "The one you think I don't know about." Amara sank into a kitchen chair. "How did you know?" "A mother knows, baby girl. You've had a look about you, a happy look but a worried one, and now you just look worried." She put down the knife and fixed Amara with her clear, knowing gaze. "He's hiding you, isn't he?" Tears welled in Amara's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. Her mother came over and wrapped her strong arms around her. "Oh, my sweet girl, I told you. Men like that, they love the idea of you in the dark. They love the thrill. But they can't handle you in the light. Their world isn't built for women like us. We're too strong, too real. We remind them of everything they're afraid of." "But he loves me, Mom. I know he does." "I'm sure he does in his way," her mother said, her voice soft but firm. "But his love is a cowardly love, and a coward's love will always choose itself when the world starts to shout. You remember that." Amara clung to her mother, the words settling deep in her soul. She thought of Richard's face, torn between her and his father, between integrity and convenience. She thought of his silence in the crew lounge, his acquiescence to the fundraiser. Her mother was right. He was a coward, but he was her coward, and she loved him with a desperation that frightened her. That night, as she lay alone in her own bed, her phone lit up with a text from Richard. "I miss you. I hate this. It's all just noise. You are my truth. You know that, right?" She stared at the screen, the words both a balm and a poison. He missed her. She was his truth. But his truth was a secret, and his courage had its limits. She typed a reply, her fingers heavy. "I know." It was all she could manage, because she did know. She knew the heartbreak was already written into their story. She just didn't know how soon the final chapter would begin, or what devastating twist would force it open. The fear was no longer a whisper. It was a drumbeat growing louder, counting down to a moment she could feel coming but was powerless to stop. Chapter 4. The nausea began subtly, a faint, rolling unease that Amara initially attributed to turbulence or a bad in-flight meal. But it persisted, a stubborn companion on layovers in Rome and quick turns to Chicago. It was a feeling that lived in the background, a sour note beneath the symphony of her life. Then came the fatigue, a profound weariness that sleep couldn't touch. She found herself dozing off in crew lounges, her body heavy and demanding rest in a way that was entirely new. She was in her bathroom getting ready for a date with Richard, a rare, risky dinner at a discreet restaurant in Greenwich Village, when she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her skin, usually rich and glowing, looked sallow. There was a faint, unfamiliar puffiness around her eyes, and her period was late. Not just a little late, it was over 2 weeks late. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the fog of her exhaustion. The pieces, the nausea, the fatigue, the missed period, clicked into place with a terrifying final sound. Her hands, which had been applying a touch of lip gloss, began to tremble. She dropped the tube into the sink with a clatter. "No," she whispered to her reflection, "it can't be." But the possibility, once acknowledged, took root and blossomed into a near certainty. She spent the entire dinner in a daze. Richard, animated, telling her about a potential promotion to a training captain position, seemed to be speaking from the other end of a long tunnel. She nodded and smiled at all the right places, but her mind was a frantic, swirling chaos. "Pregnant, I'm pregnant. What are we going to do?" She studied his face across the table, the confident set of his jaw, the easy smile he bestowed upon the waiter, the way he held his wine glass, a picture of unassailable privilege. How would that face look when she told him? Would it be the face of the man who loved her in Paris, or the face of the captain who couldn't meet her eyes in the crew lounge? She couldn't tell him, not yet, not until she was sure. The next morning, after he'd left her apartment with a quick kiss and a promise to call, she went to a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods away, her heart pounding as if she were committing a crime. She bought 3 different brands of pregnancy tests, her face burning under the fluorescent lights, convinced the cashier could see her secret. Back in her bathroom, the wait for the results was the longest 90 seconds of her life. She paced the small, tiled floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She thought of her mother raising a child alone. She thought of the airline's strict policies regarding pregnant flight attendants, the forced ground duty, the sidelined career. She thought of Richard. A timer on her phone chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that felt obscene. She forced herself to look. 2 pale blue lines, a plus sign, the word pregnant in stark digital letters. It was true. A strange, dual reality descended upon her. Part of her was terrified, imagining the scandal, the judgment, the certain end of her career as she knew it, the very real possibility that Richard would crumble under the pressure. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, felt a surge of something fierce and protective. A life, their life, growing inside her. She waited a week, living in the surreal bubble of her secret before she told him. She chose her apartment, her territory, a place where he was just Richard, not Captain Hayes. She made him dinner, her hands steady as she stirred the pot, a strange calm settling over her. She knew this moment would be a fault line. Their lives would be irrevocably split into before and after. He was in a good mood, talking animatedly about the new aircraft the airline was acquiring. He kissed her neck as she served the food, his hands warm on her waist. "This smells amazing. You're amazing." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before she put her fork down. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. "Richard," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "we need to talk." He looked up, his smile fading slightly at her tone. "Okay, what's up? You seem serious." She took a deep breath, her hands resting on her lap over her still flat stomach. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. For a moment there was no reaction at all. His face went completely blank, as if his system had shut down to process the shock. Then, a slow, dawning comprehension, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. "What?" The word was a breath, barely audible. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I've taken 3 tests, it's true." He pushed his chair back from the table, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He stood up, running both hands through his hair, his movements jerky. "How? I mean, we were careful." "Not careful enough, apparently," she said, a sharp edge to her voice. His focus on the how felt like an accusation. He began to pace the small length of her living room, a caged animal. "This is, Amara, this is a disaster." The word was a punch to her gut. "A disaster," she echoed, her calm beginning to fracture. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice rising. "My father, the airline, my promotion, this will kill it, all of it." He stopped and looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't have this baby." The room tilted. She had braced for fear, for anxiety. But she hadn't braced for this immediate, outright rejection. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there are options," he said, his voice dropping to a frantic, persuasive whisper. He came to kneel in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "We can fix this. It's early, right? We can make this go away. No one ever has to know. We can go back to the way we were." "Fix this. Make this go away." He was talking about their child, a part of him, a part of her. He saw it as a problem to be solved, a mess to be cleaned up. The hope she had been clinging to, that he would see this as he saw her, as something real and beautiful worth fighting for, shattered into a million pieces. She pulled her hands away as if burned. "Go back to the way we were?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "You mean go back to being your secret? Your dirty little secret that you're too ashamed to acknowledge in public? This isn't a scheduling conflict, Richard. This is a baby. Our baby." "Don't you think I know that?" he shot back, standing up again, his frustration boiling over. "But you're not living in reality, my reality. Do you have any idea what will happen if this gets out? My father will disown me. The board at the airline, they're old-fashioned. They'll see it as a scandal, a liability. A captain knocking up a junior flight attendant, and a black one. They'll crucify me." There it was, the unvarnished truth laid bare in her living room. It wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about her, her race, her position. She was the complication. The fight went out of her then, replaced by a cold, weary despair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger, a handsome, terrified boy in a man's uniform. "So that's it," she said, her voice flat and empty. "Your career, your reputation, your father's money, that's what matters." "It's not that simple, Amara." "It is that simple," she whispered. She stood up, turning her back on him, walking to the window. The lights of Queens twinkled, a tapestry of ordinary lives, of struggles and joys that suddenly seemed infinitely more honest than the gilded cage Richard was so desperate to protect. "You need to leave. Amara, please, we need to talk about this like adults." She didn't turn around. "There's nothing more to talk about. You've made your priorities perfectly clear. Now get out." She heard him hesitate, his breath a ragged sound in the quiet room. Then the soft click of the door as he left. The moment the latch closed, her legs gave way. She slid to the floor, her back against the wall, and wrapped her arms around her knees. Great, heaving sobs racked her body, tears of betrayal, of fear, of a future that had collapsed in the space of a single conversation. She cried for the man she thought she loved, and for the naive hope that had allowed her to believe their love could conquer anything. But as the storm of her grief began to subside, a new sensation emerged. She placed a hand on her stomach where a tiny, unseen life was taking root. A fierce, stubborn ember of determination ignited within her. He had abandoned them, but she would not. She was alone, but she was also a mother. And as she sat on the floor in the dim light, the shattered pieces of her heart began to reform around that single, unassailable truth. Chapter 5. The silence from Richard was a physical presence in Amara's apartment, heavy and suffocating. Days bled into a week without a word, no call, no text, no desperate knock at the door. The initial, searing pain of his rejection began to harden into a cold, dull ache. He had made his choice. She was on her own. But life, and the airline's relentless schedule, waited for no one. Her body, however, was beginning to rebel in new ways. The morning sickness was no longer just a morning affair, but a constant, rolling threat. The smell of jet fuel, once as familiar as her own perfume, now sent her rushing to the lavatory. On a short hop to Atlanta, the persistent, subtle odor of recycled air and stale coffee had her swallowing back bile as she served a first-class passenger his scotch. She was in the galley, squeezing her eyes shut and taking slow, deep breaths when Chloe found her. "You look like hell, Amara," Chloe said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Are you sick?" "Just a bug, I think," Amara mumbled, forcing a smile. "It'll pass." But it didn't pass. And in the close-quarters world of a flight crew, secrets have a short shelf life. The turning point came on a long haul to Frankfurt. During the meal service, a sudden, violent bout of turbulence jolted the aircraft. Amara, caught off guard while holding a heavy tray, stumbled. She didn't fall, but the sharp, protective jerk of her body, the way her hands flew instinctively to her abdomen, was a telltale sign to any experienced crew member. She looked up and met the gaze of Janet, a senior flight attendant in her 50s, a woman known for her efficiency and her strict adherence to the airline's unwritten rules. Janet's eyes, sharp and discerning, dropped to Amara's stomach, then back to her face. She didn't say a word, but a subtle, knowing look passed between them, a look that was neither kind nor condemning, but simply factual. The secret was no longer entirely her own. The summons came 2 days after they landed. It wasn't to her direct supervisor, but to the office of Harold Finch, the vice president of in-flight services. The name alone sent a chill down her spine. Finch was a relic, a man who referred to the airline as a family while presiding over its corporate machinations with cold-blooded efficiency. His assistant's email was terse, requesting her presence at the corporate headquarters at 10 a.m. the following morning. The subject line was, "Meeting regarding your status." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she rode the elevator up to the executive floor. The plush, silent carpet and the tasteful, expensive art felt deliberately intimidating. She was shown into a corner office with a breathtaking view of the city, a view meant to remind visitors of the power contained within these walls. Harold Finch sat behind a vast mahogany desk. He was a thin man with a carefully cultivated tan and silver hair, his pilot's wings pinned to his immaculate suit jacket. Seated in a chair to the side, looking pale and uncomfortable, was Richard. Amara's breath caught in her throat. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on a point on the polished surface of Finch's desk. "Ah, Miss Johnson, please have a seat," Finch said, his voice smooth as silk, his smile not reaching his eyes. He gestured to an empty chair opposite Richard. The arrangement felt like a tribunal. She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "We've asked Captain Hayes to join us," Finch began, steepling his fingers, "as this matter unfortunately involves him. It has come to our attention, through concerned members of the crew, that you may be expecting." The clinical, corporate word hung in the air, expecting, as if she were waiting for a package, not carrying a child. Amara said nothing. She looked at Richard, a silent plea for him to speak, to claim his part, to show a shred of the man she'd loved. He remained silent, a statue of shame and fear. "The airline has clear policies regarding the health and safety of our flight attendants," Finch continued, his tone shifting to one of paternalistic concern that was utterly devoid of warmth. "Given the physical demands of the role, you'll need to be medically grounded immediately. We'll need you to see the company doctor for confirmation, of course, but we must act on the information we have." "I understand the safety protocols, sir," Amara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Good," Finch leaned forward slightly. "Now there is the other, more delicate matter, the paternity." The word landed like a physical blow. Richard flinched. "The airline values its reputation, Ms. Johnson. We are a symbol of trust and reliability to the public. The conduct of our crew, especially our senior captains, is paramount." He glanced at Richard, a look that was both dismissive and expectant. "Captain Hayes has assured me that any personal relationship between the two of you was brief, unprofessional, and entirely consensual. A lapse in judgment on both your parts." Amara felt the air leave her lungs. A lapse in judgment. He was reducing their entire relationship, the whispered promises, the Parisian afternoons, the love she had believed in, to a sordid little mistake. "Is that what you told him, Richard?" Amara asked, her voice low and direct, finally breaking her silence. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "Amara, please." "Captain Hayes has been candid with us," Finch interjected smoothly, cutting him off. "He has expressed deep regret for this situation. He has a brilliant career ahead of him, Ms. Johnson, a future with this airline that should not be jeopardized by a moment of indiscretion." The message was clear. Richard was the valuable asset. She was the problem, the situation, the indiscretion. "What he's trying to say, Ms. Johnson," Finch said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, menacing whisper, "is that it would be in everyone's best interest, yours, the captain, and the airline's, if this matter were handled with the utmost discretion. For you to take your medical leave, have your child, and then perhaps seek employment elsewhere. We would, of course, offer a modest severance to facilitate a smooth transition. She was being fired. Politely, corporately, but fired all the same. They were buying her silence and her disappearance. And her Richard, was sitting there, allowing it to happen. He was letting them erase her to save himself. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly executed, that she felt numb. She looked from Finch's smug, assured face to Richard's downcast, cowardly one. The racial subtext she had always feared was now the text itself. She was the black flight attendant who had seduced the golden boy pilot, and the corporate machinery was mobilizing to neutralize the threat she posed to their pristine image. She stood up, her legs feeling like water, but her spine was rigid. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I will see the company doctor," she said, her voice cold and clear. "I will follow the medical protocols, but I will not be seeking employment elsewhere, and I will not be accepting your severance." Finch's smile tightened. "That would be unwise, Ms. Johnson. A single mother with no job. The airline can be a formidable adversary." "So can I," she said, and without another glance at Richard, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving the two men in their tower of power and prejudice. She made it to the elevator, the numbness beginning to wear off, replaced by a shaking, all-consuming rage. The doors slid shut and she was alone. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They had cornered her, threatened her, and tried to buy her off. And the man who had put a baby inside her had sat there and said nothing. The elevator descended, but Amara felt herself falling from a much greater height. The world she had known, the world of flying, of love, of future plans, had shattered. She was falling, and the only thing waiting for her at the bottom was a fight she never asked for, a fight she now had no choice but to win, for herself and for the child growing within her. Chapter 6. The official letter from the airline's medical department arrived 2 days later, confirming her grounding. It was cold, bureaucratic, and final. She was relieved of all flying duties, effective immediately until such time as she could provide medical clearance of full fitness post-pregnancy. Her pay was adjusted to a fraction of her flight salary. The financial noose was tightening, but it was the social one that threatened to choke her first. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, showing up at the crew lounge to collect her revised schedule for ground duties, mostly administrative paperwork and inventory checks, duties designed to be both monotonous and isolating. The moment she walked in, the familiar low hum of conversation stuttered and died. Heads turned. Whispers began, slithering through the room like snakes. She kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on the scheduling desk at the far end, but she could feel the weight of their stares, 100 tiny pinpricks of judgment. It was Chloe who struck the first open blow. She was holding court near the coffee machine, a circle of junior flight attendants hanging on her every word. As Amara passed, Chloe's voice, artificially loud and laced with false sympathy, cut through the silence. "Oh, Amara, honey, we heard. What a terrible, terrible situation." Amara stopped, forced to engage. "I'm fine, Chloe, thank you for your concern." "Are you, though?" Chloe pressed, her eyes wide with feigned worry. "It's just so messy. And with everything Captain Hayes has going for him, the poor man must be devastated, to have his career threatened like this." The rewrite of history was breathtaking. Richard was no longer a participant, he was a victim. Amara was the threat. "My pregnancy is a private medical matter," Amara said, her voice tight. "It has nothing to do with Captain Hayes's career." A snicker came from somewhere in the circle. Chloe gave a pitying smile. "Oh, sweetie, we all know that's not true. Janet saw you on the Frankfurt flight, the way you were clutching your stomach. And everyone knows you've been making eyes at him for months. It's just so predictable." Predictable. The word was a masterstroke of cruelty. It reduced her to a stereotype. the ambitious black woman using her body to trap a successful white man. "I'm not having this conversation," Amara said, turning away, her face burning. "No, you're just running to HR, I bet," Chloe called after her, her voice losing its sugary tone and turning sharp. "Trying to cause trouble for a good man because you couldn't take no for an answer." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and effective. Amara could feel the narrative hardening around her, cementing her in the role of the scheming seductress. She reached the scheduling desk, her hands trembling as she accepted the thin printout of her new, ground-bound life. The worst was yet to come. A few days later, she was assigned to inventory the liquor locker in a remote section of the crew base, a task she was sure Finch's office had personally arranged. She was on a stepladder, counting miniature bottles of gin, when she heard familiar voices enter the storage room behind her. She froze, recognizing the cadence of Captain Doug's drawl and another lighter, more refined voice that made her blood run cold. "Richard." "Just a damn shame, Rick," Doug was saying. "A man in your position, you have to be careful. These girls, they see the wings, they see the paycheck, and they see a ticket out of their circumstances. They don't think about the consequences for a man's career." Amara held her breath, pressed against the cool metal of the shelves, invisible. She heard Richard sigh, a weary put-upon sound. "I know, Doug, it was a moment of weakness, a stupid mistake. I never thought she'd well, you know." "Oh, I know," Doug grunted. "They always get clingy. And this one, well, she's not exactly the kind you bring home to mother, is she? You're lucky Finch is handling it. A few more months she'll be gone, and this will all be an unfortunate memory, a lesson learned." There was a pause. Amara prayed desperately for Richard to object, to defend her, to show a shred of the man she'd loved. Instead, what he said was worse. He gave a soft, complicit chuckle. It was a sound of agreement, of male bonding over a shared nuisance. "A damn expensive lesson," Richard said, his voice laced with a bitterness that was entirely self-pitying. The sound of that chuckle broke something inside Amara. It was the final confirmation that the man she loved was not just a coward, he was a collaborator in her destruction. He was allowing, even encouraging, this vile narrative to flourish because it absolved him. He was the duped aristocrat, she was the cunning peasant. Tears of hot, shamming rage filled her eyes. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to make a sound. She heard their footsteps recede, their conversation fading as they moved away, two comrades in arms, their world order preserved. She didn't know how long she stood there, trembling on the stepladder. When she finally climbed down, her legs were weak. She finished the inventory on autopilot, her mind a white noise of hurt. The final humiliation came via the company-wide gossip mill, a digital hydra that was faster and more venomous than any official memo. A rumor began to circulate, detailed and vicious, that Amara had deliberately sabotaged her birth control to trap Richard, that she had been seen flirting aggressively with him on multiple occasions, despite his clear attempts to discourage her, that she had even threatened to go to the media with false claims of racism if he didn't support her. She became a pariah. Crew members she had considered friends now averted their eyes in the hallways or crossed to the other side. Whispers followed her to the cafeteria, where she now ate alone. The few who did look at her directly did so with a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. One afternoon, as she was leaving the headquarters, she saw Richard standing by the curbside, waiting for his car. He was laughing with another senior captain, looking carefree and untouchable. For a fleeting second, their eyes met across the busy sidewalk. The laughter died on his lips. His expression shifted to one of panicked guilt, and then, quickly, to a cold, blank dismissal. He turned his back on her completely, engaging his colleague in animated conversation once more, a living wall of rejection. That was the moment the last flicker of hope died. He wasn't just abandoning her, he was erasing her. He was allowing his colleagues to paint her as a predator so he could remain the victim, the promising young captain who had been unfairly targeted. She walked to the subway station, the city noise a dull roar in her ears. The shame that had been heaped upon her was immense, a crushing weight designed to grind her into silence. But as she descended the grimy steps into the underground, something shifted. The public scorn, the cruel rumors, Richard's final, cowardly turn, it had all burned away the last of her illusions. There was nothing left to lose. The shame began to curdle into something else, something harder and more durable, a scorching, righteous anger. They had tried to bury her in their lies. They had tried to make her feel small and ashamed for loving someone, for carrying a child. Standing on the crowded platform, surrounded by strangers, she placed a hand on her stomach. She could feel a new solidity there, a tiny, undeniable presence. "They can't touch us," she whispered into the rumble of an approaching train, the words of vow. "They can whisper all they want, but they can't have you, and they can't break me." The train doors slid open. She stepped inside, leaving the glittering, toxic world of the airline above ground. She was heading home, to her mother, to her truth. The battle for her reputation was lost. The war for her future and her child was just beginning. Chapter 7. The final act of betrayal came not with a shout but with a registered letter. It arrived at her apartment on a Tuesday morning, the sun streaming through the window as if it were a day like any other. The envelope was thick, expensive, and bore the logo of a law firm she didn't recognize. Her name was typed with cold precision. There was no return address, but she knew. With hands that had only just stopped shaking from morning sickness, she tore it open. The language was dense, legalese designed to obfuscate and intimidate, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was from Richard's family's attorneys. The letter stated that, upon advice of counsel and in light of the unsubstantiated and potentially defamatory implications surrounding their brief personal association, Captain Richard Hayes was formally severing all ties with Ms. Amara Johnson. It went on to state that he denied paternity of the unborn child and would be contesting any and all future claims for support. To avoid further unnecessary distress for all parties, he was offering a one-time lump sum payment of $25,000. The condition was absolute. She must sign the enclosed confidentiality agreement, forever relinquishing her right to speak of him, their relationship, or the circumstances of her pregnancy. It was, the letter concluded, a full and final settlement. The pages fluttered from her hands onto the kitchen floor. $25,000. To him, it was pocket change, the cost of a watch. To her, it was a year's salary now that she was grounded. It was diapers, formula, doctor's appointments. It was survival, and he was using it to buy her silence, to legally erase his responsibility, to make their child disappear. She stumbled to the bathroom and vomited, her body revolting against the sheer, gut-wrenching cruelty of it. He wasn't just abandoning her. He was launching a preemptive strike. He was denying his own child. The man who had whispered about a future, about being a family, was now hiding behind lawyers, paying to make the problem go away. She called his phone. It went straight to voicemail. She texted him. "How could you?" The message showed as delivered, but there was no response. The silence was a void, and she was falling into it. 2 days later, she saw the headline in a society blog her mother sometimes read. Aviation scion Richard Hayes and heiress Alina Vance announce engagement. There was a picture of them, Richard looking handsome and resolute in a tuxedo, his arm around a slender, blonde woman in a dazzling diamond necklace. The article gushed about the merger of two great families, the power couple of the skis, and their upcoming, lavish wedding at the Hayes family estate in Connecticut. It made no mention of a pregnant flight attendant. That story had been successfully quarantined, a contained leak in the lower decks, never allowed to reach the rarefied air of the upper classes. That was the moment the heartbreak truly crystallized into a permanent, frozen scar. He hadn't just chosen his career, he had chosen his world. He had chosen a life where she was an inconvenient ghost, and he was erecting a gilded fortress to keep her out. The fundraiser he'd told her about hadn't been a one-off. It had been an audition. and he had passed. The financial reality descended with the weight of an anchor. Her reduced pay from the airline barely covered her rent. Her modest savings evaporated after the first obstetrician's appointment and the prenatal vitamins. The dream of writing a novel was a laughable fantasy from another lifetime. Now, it was about survival. She had to leave her apartment, the one with the view of the city lights they had looked at together. She found a smaller, darker one-bedroom in a less desirable part of Queens, its walls thin, the sound of neighbors arguing a constant soundtrack. She sold things online: a leather jacket Richard had bought her in Milan, a piece of jewelry her father had left her, the small television. Each sale felt like an amputation, a piece of her old life severed. Her mother, her rock, took on extra shifts at the hospital, the shadows under her eyes deepening. "We'll manage, baby girl," she'd say, her voice thick with fatigue and a fury she kept carefully contained for Amara's sake. "We always do." But the strain was immense. Amara's body was changing, her belly swelling, a visible testament to the scandal that made it impossible to hide. She took a part-time job as a receptionist at a rundown gym, the smell of sweat and bleach turning her stomach. The manager, a leering man in his 50s, would watch her, his eyes dropping to her stomach. "Single mom, huh?" he'd said on her first day. "Tough break, don't expect any special treatment here." She worked the desk, her feet swelling, smiling at members while inside she was screaming. This was her life now. This was the future Richard's $25,000 was supposed to buy. One evening, exhausted and defeated, she sat on the floor of her new, barren living room, surrounded by unopened boxes. The pressure, the loneliness, the sheer unfairness of it all crashed down upon her. Great, racking sobs tore from her chest. She cried for the man she'd lost, for the future that had been stolen, for the child who would never know its father. She cried until she was hollow, until there were no tears left. In the profound silence that followed, a tiny, fluttering sensation bloomed low in her abdomen. It was quick, like the brush of a butterfly's wing, so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. Then it came again, a quickening. Her breath hitched. She pressed her hands against the spot, her tears drying on her cheeks. It was her baby, their baby, saying hello, saying I am here, we are here. The $25,000 check was still on the counter, next to the unsigned confidentiality agreement. She looked at it, then down at her stomach, where her child had just announced its presence. A cold, clear resolve settled over her. He could send his lawyers. He could marry his heiress. He could deny them until he was blue in the face. But he could not deny the life fluttering inside her. He could not buy the truth. She stood up, her body aching but her spirit suddenly, fiercely calm. She picked up the check and the legal documents. She walked to the shredder she'd bought for her old billing statements, the one she hadn't yet unpacked. She found it in a box, plugged it in, and fed the pages into it. The machine whirred, chewing the expensive paper into 1,000 meaningless confetti strips. The check, with its 5 zeros, disappeared last. She was not his dirty secret to be paid off. Her child was not a liability to be settled. They were a fact, a truth. She was alone, yes. She was scared, yes. But as she placed a protective hand over the fluttering in her womb, she knew she was also something else. She was a mother, and she would fight, not with lawyers or threats, but by living, by surviving, by raising her child in the light of that truth, no matter how much others tried to pay to keep it in the dark. Richard Hayes had chosen his gilded cage. Amara Johnson was free, and that freedom, though terrifying, was hers. What's your take on this? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And not to miss out on other episodes, hit the like, subscribe, and share button. Don't forget to turn on notification as well.